Well, hey everybody, it's Mr. Schauber. Hope you're doing well. I want to narrate this PowerPoint for you regarding the 11th through 27th Amendments to the Constitution. This will help you do your assignment and hopefully hopefully this makes sense and you'll learn something about these amendments. Every amendment was passed for a reason, and we've only had 27 total. The first 10 at the same time, known as the Bill of Rights. And of course, since then, we've only had 17 more passed. And so each one's important. Each one deals with things that the country, the states, and the citizens thought were important at that time. Let's start with the 11th Amendment, passed in 1795. It prohibits people from suing states in which they do not reside or citizens of another country from suing uh, another state in federal court. Uh, and this just prevents lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits for no good reason from happening. Although people can file suit in federal court against state authorities for depriving that person of constitutional rights. And we have seen that uh, where people believe their rights have been violated. And so they sue a state. And sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. But some of those cases, of course, like Texas versus Johnson or Miranda versus Arizona, some of those cases have happened. The 12th Amendment, passed in 1804, requires members of the Electoral College to cast two separate ballots, one for president and one for vice president. Before this, and there were only a few elections in U.S. history before this, but the person that got the most electoral votes was the president, and the person that got the second most electoral votes was the vice president. And so, in order to not have that be the case, but rather to have presidential candidates pick vice presidential candidates to run with them as a running mate and both get elected on the same ticket, the 12th Amendment was put into place. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as you can see up top, are known as the Civil War Amendments because they were all passed around the time of the ending of the Civil War, and they all dealt with things uh, that were issues for which the Civil War was either fought over or was greatly, these issues were debated at this time. Let's start with the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery or forced servitude in the United States of America. Once and for all, no more slavery. That was passed the year the Civil War ended. The 14th Amendment, passed 3 years later in 1868, does three things. It defines citizenship. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. And so, technically, all the African Americans who were not considered citizens before the Civil War are now considered citizens. They are free, no more slavery, and now they're now considered citizens. And all people should have due process of law afforded to them. So if people get in trouble with the law, they should have, especially the Fourth through Eighth Amendments, apply to them, and they should be treated fairly by the law. And finally, equal protection under the law. If two people do the same thing, regardless of skin color, regardless of gender, regardless of any of those other factors, they should be treated the same way by the law. Most of the lawsuits that will happen concerning civil rights from 1868 until really 1968, 1970, maybe even to this present day, but especially during the civil rights movement of the 20th century, most of the lawsuits that are levied will refer to the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. And so this amendment is going to be huge as far as especially used in lawsuits going forward. And then the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, says citizens, which these ex-slaves and all African Americans and all people born or naturalized in the U.S. are, have the right to vote. Now, this at first only applied, according to how many states, or really all the states interpreted this, only applied to black men. Black women did not have the right to vote yet. But for a while, black men did vote. And if you're wondering, well, why for a while? because many states passed laws to prevent black men from voting over time. Even though they had the right to vote by the 15th Amendment, states passed certain things that prevented them from exercising that right. The 16th Amendment, passed in 1913, gave the federal government the authority to collect income tax. So this is one that drives people crazy, but this was during the Woodrow Wilson administration, and income tax is going to be on the table now, and of course the percentages have fluctuated over the years, but income tax is not everyone's favorite. The 17th Amendment, also passed in 1913, allowed people the ability to directly elect the senators for their state. Before this, state legislatures chose the senators, and so this hands the power of voting for senators to the people. So that is a victory for the citizenry of the United States, and it's been this way ever since. The 18th Amendment, passed in 1919, prohibited alcohol in the United States. Making it, consuming it, selling it, transporting it was all illegal. And this amendment will last for a number of years. And prohibition will work in some places fairly well and will not work at all in other places. But it's on the books as the 18th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, passed the next year in 1920, gives women the right to vote. Now, this was basically interpreted to mean only white women. And so minority women still do not have the right to vote at this time, but white women get the right to vote in 1920. The 20th Amendment, passed in 1933, says that a president is to be inaugurated on January 20th. Elections are in November, and then the next January 20th, the inauguration occurs. Before this, presidents were inaugurated in March, and it had been that way since George Washington. But now with the 20th Amendment, January 20th is the inauguration date, and that remains the same today. The 21st Amendment, and also in 1933, repealed the 18th Amendment, and prohibition was no longer. This is the only time in U.S. history when one amendment has repealed another amendment. And so the 18th Amendment was out and the 21st Amendment was in. The 22nd Amendment established a two-term limit for U.S. presidents. No president had served more than 2 terms until Franklin D. Roosevelt had won election 4 times. And Congress finally in 1951, just 6 years after the death of President Roosevelt, decided that we should limit presidents to 2 terms and no more. And so it's been that way ever since. The 23rd Amendment in 1961 allowed residents of the District of Columbia the right to vote for the president. And so seems like it'd be pretty obvious, but the District of Columbia is not a state, it's a district. And so for quite a long time, residents of DC had not been able to vote in presidential elections, but since 1961, they have been able to. The 24th Amendment, passed in 1964, outlawed poll taxes as far as voting went. For a long time, many states had used poll taxes as a requirement to vote. So voting wasn't necessarily free, at least for everybody. And this outlaws poll taxes. So you don't have to pay to vote. The 25th Amendment in 1967 outlined the procedures for succession to the presidency. In case something happened to the president died or became incapacitated. And you can see there on the list the order to succeed the president. And so we've only ever got as far down as vice president when a president has died, but that is That is the list of succession. The 26th Amendment, passed in 1971 during the Vietnam War era, allowed 18-year-olds the right to vote. Previous to this, it had been 21 years of age, and you started seeing buttons and signs that said things like old enough to fight, old enough to vote. The average age of the American soldier in Vietnam was 19, and they were going off to fight, and they couldn't vote yet, and so they were coming back. The ones that did come back, were saying, "Hey, wait a minute here, I'm taking a bullet uh, for my country, but I can't vote in elections, so we got to change that." And so Congress did. And finally, the 27th Amendment in 1992 gave Congress the ability to raise its own pay. But if they do so, they have to wait until after the next election for it to take effect. They don't usually do so very often because of the optics. It's not real popular with the common person when they hear that Congress has raised its own pay, but they do have the ability to do that. It's just they have to wait a while before the the pay increase kicks in. So anyway, these are the 11th through 27th amendments, and hopefully this makes some sense and you learned something and it was worth your time. We'll talk to you later.